Welcome. My name is Joyce Morrissette. I'm the clinical suicide prevention trainer here at NAMI, Maine. Joining me in the studio today is our senior clinical director, Greg Marley. And today our episode will address how to support a loved one who has suicidal thoughts. To help guide our conversation, we're very excited to introduce a special guest. Stacey Friedenthal, psychologist, licensed clinical social worker, is a psychotherapist, educator, writer, consultant, and speaker who specializes in helping people at risk for suicide. She has authored 2 books, Loving Someone with Suicidal Thoughts, What Family, Friends, and Partners Can Say and Do, and Helping the Suicidal Person, Tips and Techniques for Professionals. She also created and maintains the website Speaking of Suicide. She works as an associate professor at the University of Denver Graduate School of Social Work and has a small psychotherapy practice and consulting practice. Dr. Friedenthal lives in Denver, Colorado, with her husband Pete and their collection of cats. You can learn more about her work at staceyfriedenthal.com. Welcome to the podcast, Stacey. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Great. So let's begin. You have worked in the field of suicide prevention since 1994. So that's 3 decades of experience. Could you please tell our listeners a little about your work, including the 2 books that you've published?
Sure. Well, in 1994 is when I did training for a suicide hotline in Dallas, Texas. And that is what introduced me to the world of suicide prevention. I myself also have experienced suicidal thoughts in the past, and so I have both a professional and personal view. And then did you ask about the books?
Yes, both. What are the titles of the books, and what is, could you distinguish between them, please?
Sure. So the first book I wrote is Helping the Suicidal Person, Tips and Techniques for Professionals. And as the subtitle indicates, it's for professionals. And then the next book, which just came out a year ago, is for loved ones of people who have suicidal thoughts. And that book is Loving Someone with Suicidal Thoughts, What Family, Friends, and Partners Can Say and Do. And there's some overlap in terms of the book for professionals and the book for lay people, but there are specific issues that family and friends experience that professionals do not, and vice versa.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. So in the latest book, Loving Someone with Suicidal Thoughts, you begin with the question, why suicide? So Stacey, in your latest book, Loving Someone with Suicidal Thoughts, you begin with the question, why suicide is the name of the chapter. And in your experience, why do people die by suicide?
It's such a tough question because we don't really ultimately know the answer. And the answer may vary for different people. But what I see overwhelmingly in people I talk with who have experienced suicidal thoughts or attempted suicide or sadly even gone on to die by suicide is pain, psychological pain. And that may seem obvious.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, people who are suicidal are experiencing some kind of psychological pain. But the reason I mention it explicitly is that there are theories of suicide that focus on risk factors or neurochemistry, genetics, and those theories risk losing sight of what the person is experiencing.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
And Ed Schneidman, who's considered like the father or grandfather of modern suicidology, he has a pithy quote. Excuse me. He has a pithy quote that I can't remember verbatim, but the gist is that happy people don't die by suicide.
Mm.
And so there's always some element of pain or stress or trauma or overwhelm. I said psychological pain earlier, but it also could be physical pain.
Mm-hmm.
And in turn, the physical pain could create enormous psychological pain. But it tends to be, whatever negative experience that humans can have, and not the positive ones.
Mm-hmm. Yes, thank you for sharing that. We talk about this in our trainings as well, and bring up ambivalence that people can have, but that they often are experiencing pain, and that's it's that overwhelming pain. One of the things
And I would add to that,
please,
it's overwhelming pain plus a feeling of being trapped.
Okay, thank you.
Not having a way out of that pain.
Okay, thank you. So suicide remains taboo, Stacey, in many quarters. What are some ways, in your view, to tackle the stress of asking someone if they have suicidal thoughts?
That's a great question. I think I would reframe it a little and say we don't need to tackle the stress as much as we need to accommodate the stress. That if you feel stressed or afraid to talk about suicide or to ask someone if they have suicidal thoughts, not to let that stress or fear stop you.
Mm.
It is, a scary topic. It's scary if someone you love or otherwise care about is having thoughts of ending their life.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a book from, I think, the 70s or 80s, a self-help book. The title is Feel the Fear and Do It Anyway.
Mm-hmm.
And in this context, I would say feel the fear and talk about it anyway. Or feel the fear and ask about suicide anyway. Not to let that fear stop you.
I remember reading that in the book and really liked it. So thank you for sharing that. So can you share with us some of the clues that a person is at risk for acting on suicidal thoughts?
Sure. Well, the most evident clue, and often people hide this, but when it does happen, is important, is when somebody is talking about suicide,
Mm-hmm.
or talking about having thoughts of suicide, or even maybe they've even attempted suicide. In my mind, there's no such thing as a non-serious attempt.
Mm-hmm.
People will say, oh, that was a serious suicide attempt, which implies that other suicide attempts aren't. There may be medically serious suicide attempts where there's more medical treatment needed. But if somebody's engaging in suicidal behavior or communications, that would be a huge warning sign.
Mm-hmm.
Other warning signs could be behaviors, like, for example, giving things away,
Mm-hmm.
making preparations, like if it looks like, all of a sudden you notice that someone has prepared a will
Yes.
and they haven't before, and they also have seemed depressed and have been saying things that worry you, that could be a warning sign. I also want to say that when people don't explicitly talk about their suicidal thoughts, they may still drop hints.
Mm-hmm.
They may make jokes, or they may make statements like, "Ugh, I wish I'd never been born," or "I wish I could go to sleep forever." And those statements should be taken seriously. And by that, I don't mean, oh, the person wants to die and call 911. I recommend always being conservative about emergency help.
Mm-hmm.
But I also mean there should be an effort to understand what's going on.
Mm-hmm.
If someone says, I wish I could never wake up again, there could be a question about what's going on.
Mm-hmm.
It sounds like you're hurting.
Right. So we talked about, it's scary, the fear and asking. It's important to ask. And can you share more about how we can ask the question, how we can
Sure.
start and open up
Sure.
these conversations. Thank you.
I'm sorry, what was that last part?
Yeah, no. How we can ask and open up these conversations is all.
I think the most important thing is to actually ask the question and to actually say the words, whether it's, do you think of suicide, or do you think of ending your life, or do you think of killing yourself? I mean, people may have different preferences for different terms, but to not beat around the bush and say things like, do you think of hurting yourself? Because hurting yourself could mean suicide, but it could mean something else too.
Right.
Some people hurt themselves as a way to avoid acting on suicidal thoughts. I also think that by asking the question directly, we're sending the message that we can talk about this topic and that we can handle it and we want to know. There are, I don't recommend necessarily going up to somebody and saying, hey, I haven't seen you in a while. Are you thinking of suicide? There are ways that we might want to more naturally ask the question. And one way is through what the psychiatrist Sean Shea calls normalization. And by that, I don't mean we're normalizing suicide itself, but we are normalizing that millions of people have suicidal thoughts. And so if someone is sharing with us something that conveys stress or trauma or pain or other problems that the person is experiencing, we might say something like, a lot of people who go through this kind of stress, they sometimes think of suicide. Do you have suicidal thoughts? And then that way, again, we're conveying non-judgmentalism. We're conveying that we know that suicidal thoughts happen and that they're relatively common. They're not totally common, but in the United States, about 15 million people a year have serious suicidal thoughts. And here I am using the word serious because that's the question they're asked. Have you seriously considered suicide in the previous year? So asking directly, not beating around the bush, not, I'm going to use a highly academic term, not freaking out. If the person says yes, not freaking out, but also not centering your own emotional response, like trying to keep the focus on the person and what they're going through rather than whatever emotional response you might have, which could be fear or sadness or anger. Sometimes people feel angry when someone they love has suicidal thoughts, and that's a valid emotion, but now would not be the time to share that.
Right. Thank you. And I love that you shared to be clear and direct and not vague. I have shared in trainings that, as a nurse early in my career, we would say, are you thinking of hurting yourself? Do you feel safe? And you've given us some, clear and direct ways to ask. So when we ask the question, one of the things I have shared with you was that my favorite chapter in the book was called Brave Listening. And I noticed that David Jobs, who wrote the foreword in your book, said that you have an astonishing capacity to take the perspective of others. So, Stacey, how can we learn to listen bravely? And are there some tips that you can share and offer to us?
Definitely. So brave listening is a phrase I use for what in clinical texts you might see referred to as active listening or reflective listening, empathic listening. Sometimes I even see it called radical listening. And I call it brave listening, and I'm sure I'm not the only person ever to call it that, but in my book I call it brave listening because it is scary sometimes to have these conversations. And brave listening is asking the questions whose answers you fear and listening to what's hard to hear without immediately trying to change what the person is saying. So often if somebody says, I'm thinking of ending it all, or I'm thinking of, God, I wish I could just die, often the response is, you don't mean that, or don't say something like that, or think of all the good things you've got going on. And these are well-intentioned efforts to help. They're also efforts to manage one's own anxiety as the listener, because it can be scary to hear someone talk about feeling hopeless and feeling in enormous pain or suffering and feeling trapped in that pain. All of those can be hard to listen to. And so what I urge with brave listening is again, feeling the fear and listening anyway to what the person is saying without immediately responding with advice or superficial reassurance or persuasion or rebuttal or anything like that. All of those can shut down the conversation, whereas in brave listening, there are responses that can open up the conversation.
I love that.
And you asked for tips, so to open up the conversation, I mean, it's really deceptively simple. I mean, we've got master's programs in counseling, and the suicide prevention training I did in 1994 was 54 hours. But really, we don't need that much training to listen bravely. What it requires is understanding that less is more, and that how we listen is more important than what we say. And so some responses to someone disclosing something painful could be, tell me more. Or, that sounds really hard. Or, oh, God, you're really going through a hard time, aren't you? Anything that can kind of reflect what the person's saying or show compassionate curiosity about understanding what the person is going through can encourage the person to keep talking. And there's also, I used the word encourage, there's the phrase minimal encouragers, that sometimes just saying, or I see, or, nodding your head, those are minimal encouragers in that you're encouraging the person to keep talking rather than stopping the process with those things I named before, like advice or problem solving or reassurance.
Right. You're really listening. You're not checking off boxes either, or just...
You are not. Often when somebody says they have suicidal thoughts, they're immediately barraged with questions. This is a pet peeve of mine. I see it a lot in training and with students, and not only that, also with highly seasoned professionals, that often when somebody says that they have suicidal thoughts, the immediate question is, do you have a plan? And for me, this is not empathetic or empathic, because what that question is doing is serving the listener's needs to get information and to manage their own anxiety. Because if you don't have a plan, then I don't have to worry as much. But asking somebody with suicidal thoughts if they have a plan doesn't open up the conversation about what's hurting. And often the question, do you have a plan, is followed by other questions like, do you have the means to kill yourself? Do you have access to the means? Could you obtain access to the means? Have you made an attempt? How many times have you attempted? These are all suicide risk assessment questions that are not therapeutic. I don't mean that it's hurtful or harmful to ask the questions, but they're not serving the person's needs to talk about what's going on with them and to tell their story without it being checking off boxes about risk.
So, Stacey, one of the things that seems so important in that is inviting the story.
Yes.
I did crisis work for a long time, and that's what I realized I was doing, inviting someone to tell their reality without too many questions getting in the way.
Yes. And it's also rather rare
Mm.
that people experience that invitation. You know, I mean, our as humans, our instinctive responses tend to be to try to help someone feel better. And that's well intentioned, but sometimes people need to be able to say that they feel bad.
Mm-hmm.
There's a line in a David Wilcox song. This isn't verbatim. I'm probably going to, butcher it a little, but the gist is, before you try to pull me out of the well, ask me if I'm finished.
Mm-hmm.
And those ideas of listening are about being with somebody
Mm-hmm.
and listening with them as they tell their story, rather than trying to change their story.
As I'm listening to you, I'm thinking of the word like accompanying and being with. So thank you. When
You're welcome.
when you are engaged in conversation and listening to someone and you're concerned, can you tell us ways that we can help someone, share with our listeners how we can help someone to stay safe? And
Sure.
maybe something about including if there is indeed an emergency. What are your insights here?
Sure. There's a whole spectrum of responses depending on how much danger the person seems to be in. And obviously, if someone has just made an attempt, or their behavior is out of control, or they appear to be hearing voices or auditory hallucinations that they are sort of under the thrall of rather than observing, then listening may not be your go-to in those instances.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I mean, it's context dependent.
Yes.
That listening may be what you do, but those are situations where it's more likely the person may need emergency help. As much as possible, I recommend avoiding calling 911, because often that results in the police coming, which can be traumatic for the person. Now, there may be times where you do need to call 911 because somebody's just made an attempt and they need immediate medical attention. That's different than if somebody tells you they're having suicidal thoughts and they're not sure they can stay safe because there are other options besides immediately calling for emergency help. One option is to talk with the person about making a safety plan, and going through with them the things they can do to stay safe. And that can also be useful to you because it can help you gauge, are there things the person can do to stay safe? And those things could include things that could distract them from their suicidal thoughts. They could include people or they could be with, or places they could go, people they could confide in, which might be different than the people they enjoy being with. Maybe they're in therapy and they could call their therapist. Maybe they call a crisis line. And if in talking with somebody about their safety planning, it can help you to get a feel for if they do have other options or how focused they are on suicide. Which leads me to another point, and it's a little off the focus of what you asked, but I think it's important, and that's that there are many things we can do to help somebody who has suicidal thoughts, and there are many things we can do to try to prevent suicide from happening.
Yep.
But we also are limited. And so I don't want to give the impression that you should be able to know if somebody is planning to end their life, because sometimes we cannot know unless the person tells us, and the person may choose not to tell us. And I'm saying that because many people who have lost somebody to suicide, they can feel blamed when people give the message or the impression that you should be able to stop suicide.
Thank you. Do people recover from suicidal thoughts?
Definitely, the vast majority let me back up a bit.
Sure.
Recovery can mean two things. Recovery can mean never having suicidal thoughts,
Yep.
or recovery can mean learning to respond to those thoughts differently. Because some people, it's sort of like a radio playing in the background. They just constantly have thoughts of suicide, or maybe they don't have them constantly, but whenever they're under stress, their mind may go to suicide as an option. And so, can somebody recover who still has suicidal thoughts? Yes, if they learn to observe those thoughts without acting on them, or being influenced by them, or being crushed by them. To be frank, if they learn to respond to them in a way that recognizes them as thoughts and not edicts or even suggestions, but just thoughts that they have. And then there are people who do stop having suicidal thoughts. And we can just look at the statistics. We know that 15 million people in the United States seriously consider suicide in a year. And we also know that almost 50,000 die by suicide.
Right.
And those 50,000 are all tragedies. Even one is too many, and 50,000 is devastating. And yet, I find it encouraging that 14,950,000 people don't die by suicide who have suicidal thoughts. We also know that among people who attempt suicide, the vast majority who attempt suicide and survive do not go on to die by suicide later. And so both of those statistics are hopeful statistics for me.
Agreed. And I'd like to, gosh, we could talk to you for a long time because you're bringing so much guidance and expertise. But as we begin to wrap up our conversation, Stacey, you have hope really woven throughout your book, which I recommend. And how can we foster hope together?
That's a really good question, because hope, in my first book, I say hope is the antidote to suicidality. It's sort of the kryptonite. To ask about hard times they've gotten through before and what got them through those times, what helped them. To ask the person what are their reasons for being alive, or what have been their reasons for being alive. And I don't recommend sort of hollow statements of hope, like the phrase "it gets better" has helped many people, to be sure, but also it's made other people feel hopeless because they don't think it will get better. And they think, well, you don't get it if you think it will get better. And so we may not know that something can get better, but we do know that everything changes at some point, and that there are people that we haven't met who we will be glad to meet. We know that there are things we haven't learned. There may be treatments we haven't tried. And I'm saying we as in the royal we. And so all of those